is hard for many of us to understand what it means to be taken from our home and our friends and our family against our will, to become enslaved, and to have no rights at all, not even over our own bodies. But there surely was a time in your life, certainly was in mine, when we felt trapped in some way, when we felt powerless or isolated, unknown and uncared for. All of these elements go into Hagar's story. Hagar's name is actually a composite word in Hebrew. Ha means the, Gar means resident alien, and we would have said her name in Hebrew, Hagar. She became a part of Abraham and Sarah's household when they were sojourning in Egypt. Pharaoh paid a handsome bride price for the privilege of marrying Sarah. So ancient Jewish commentators add that Hagar was given to Sarah as a personal handmaid in the palace. Some also contend she was actually a daughter of Pharaoh. However, it seems neither Sarah nor Abraham ever bothered to learn her name. They simply called her the resident alien. Judging from the rest of her story, it is probable Hagar was young, healthy, lovely, and most likely a virgin, as she later was considered an ideal surrogate to ensure the child was Abraham's and no others. When Abraham and Sarah were cast out of Egypt, of course, keeping all of Abraham's ill-gotten treasure, Hagar's life changed dramatically. Taken from her homeland, taken out of the palace, and presumably taken away from her family and community, Hagar now was Sarah's possession, so that Sarah could do whatever she wished with her. In the writing of Hagar's story, the narrator wove in several harbingers of the Exodus to come. Pharaoh sent Abraham away, never wanting to see him again. Hagar was part of a great treasure given by Pharaoh, and taken in the flight from Egypt. She was enslaved by foreigners. And when Sarah abused her, the same words are used as the description of the Hebrews' enslavement in Egypt 4 centuries later. Now, slavery was actually a part of every culture in the ancient Near East, although Hagar's servitude began in the relative ease and comfort of Pharaoh's palace as the specially selected personal handmaiden to the king's wife. All that changed when plague swept through Pharaoh's household, and ultimately Pharaoh exiled every person and everything having to do with Abraham. Hagar's life took a sharp, unexpected, and devastating turn. There is no way she could have known, as Sarah and all the servants were hastily grabbing their belongings, that her destiny was underway. All she knew in that moment is that she was being torn from her home and her country and her people and from the good life she had known. And the family she had been assigned to, once held in great honor, was now fleeing under wrath and condemnation. Once in the wilderness, when life had settled back down to the previous rhythm of pastoral nomadic life, it seems reasonable to believe Hagar may have had her own hopes and dreams of what the rest of her life could hold. Of the hundreds of servants, not to mention the 300-plus warriors in Abraham's retinue, there may have been someone Hagar loved and looked forward to marrying and having a family with. That all changed when Sarah, who had every right under the laws of the culture she had come from, decided to build a family through Hagar. Genesis 16 states, Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham as his wife, Isha, the same status as Sarah herself. Now, there was a secondary wife category of a lesser status, what we might call today concubine, but Abraham and Sarah wanted Hagar's baby to be their full heir, which meant Hagar was a stand-in for Sarah, not a concubine in her own right. Because Sarah could do this, make Hagar become her full surrogate, we know Hagar was enslaved and not simply a servant, because she had no right to her own body. And once again, whatever Hagar thought her life could be like, that was taken away from her on that day. She would no longer be considered marriageable or available to make her own home. And she did get pregnant. But try to imagine what that must have been like for a woman who was called the resident alien, who had twice suffered extreme loss at the hands of these two people who had been forced to have sex with the master, and now carried a baby who would never be considered her own, but the heir produced by the mistress. When she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my slave girl to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Your slave girl is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she ran away from her. Look at Hagar's contempt. Instead of being built up with the prospect of having children through her slave Hagar, Sarah was looked down upon. In the Hebrew, verse 4 reads, "Her mistress was dishonorable in Hagar's eyes." Sarah lost honor rather than gained honor by the very process that was supposed to build her up. And then there's the blame game. It isn't a puzzle that she blamed this all on Abraham. Abraham could have reassured Sarah about her place in God's promises as his own wife, one flesh. Instead, Abraham easily discarded Sarah and accepted Hagar. And then there's the irresponsibility and callousness of Abraham because he handed the crisis off to Sarah. Domestic affairs were her jurisdiction. And finally, there was the venting of rage. Sarah seemed only too willing to work out her anger, her bruised sense of dignity, and her profound disappointment on Hagar. And now imagine Hagar's crushed spirit when Abraham did not even look at her, but said to Sarah, "Hey, you own her. Do what you want with her." Hagar, the palace handmaiden of a royal wife, had plummeted to the pit of forced sex, a very likely unwanted pregnancy, and now treatment so harsh it was the same abuse that would make Sarah's descendants, centuries later, cry out in despair. Now, we talk about the risk Hagar took in running out into the wilderness. She could have lost her baby. She could have lost her own life. But knowing the facts, is it any wonder she ran? Had she ever been so abused like that ever before in her life? Did she perhaps fear she would not survive what was happening to her? In the wilderness, having fled what must have seemed unsurvivable circumstances, Hagar must have realized she was truly, in every way, lost. When the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to shore. This is the first appearance of this phrase in the Bible, the angel of the Lord, and most scholars believe this is a theophany, the physical, although pre-incarnate, appearance of Christ, the Son of God. And he said 4 things to her. "Hagar, slave girl of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" The Lord spoke into the identity she now had, knowing what she was called by, knowing what had been done to her, and who had done it. Hagar admitted she was running away, but she seemed to have no plan for where she was running to. The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." Why? Why not create a safe place for her in the wilderness, rather than send her back into the teeth of those who had so misused her? God did not say, and Hagar may not have known, that God intended for her to experience the grace and blessing of God within the household of Abraham and Sarah, where God would be present and Hagar would be provided for. I picture Hagar's shocked and drawn face, hearing those hard words from the Lord. But God was not finished. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude. That should be kind of familiar language. It's the same kind of language the Lord used when God gave the same kind of promise to Abraham. But of special note to you and me, and of great encouragement and affirmation to Hagar, was how God phrased this promise. I will. This was a promise attached to the command. Go back to that place, as hard as it is, and I will be there with you. I will guarantee a future you never imagined, but which I will personally attend to. And the other phrase is your offspring. To Abraham and Sarah, Hagar was no better than a nameless tool. But to God, she was a person, one of great value, and God saw the baby she was carrying within her as her offspring. God created a bond for Hagar with that unborn child. This was not Sarah's. This was Hagar's child, a child of promise and destiny apart from whatever God had in mind for Abraham and Sarah. Then God told her about the baby she would have. And the angel of the Lord said to her, Now you have conceived, and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, with his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall live at odds with all his kin. She could take comfort in knowing that her submission would provide the way for her baby to be born and taken care of. He would be named Ishmael, a name that means God hears, because God listened to her affliction. Ishmael would be healthy and strong, a nonconformist, filled with all the energy and ambition and wild freedom that Hagar must have been longing for in that moment. Hagar understood something spiritually deep about the Lord. So she named the Lord who spoke to her, You are El Roi. For she said, Have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him? She realized God had seen her. The Lord knew her just as she was, understood her with great compassion in her inmost depths and all that concerned her. And she saw God in the angel of the Lord. She also understood the Lord's meaning. She understood the Lord had heard her broken heart, and God would provide for her just as she agreed to do as God said. This naming of God by a person is without precedent in the Hebrew Scriptures. No one else was ever given that privilege. And we learn here that submission to God results in blessing. God is the one who understands our deepest thoughts and feelings, the one who is listening to our broken hearts. Is the Lord asking you where you're coming from? And are you running away from your trouble instead of meeting it? Do you know where you're headed? Or are you just looking back, trying to put distance between you and the problem without dealing with where your running is taking you? What is God saying to you in all of this right now? Well, Hagar's third and seemingly disastrous turn in life came at the celebration of Isaac's weaning. At 14, Ishmael would have been considered a young man. Years had passed, and it seems a strong attachment had developed between Abraham and his son, whom he thought would be his heir. Abraham had asked God to bless Ishmael, and it seemed God had blessed him. But now tension had reemerged, and God confirmed to Abraham that Hagar and Ishmael must go. Their destiny was not connected with Abraham anymore. And just like that, Ishmael was relegated from child of promise to a child of a slave. It does seem shocking that Abraham gave Hagar so little in their parting. However, they were only about 20 miles from the border of Egypt, so these provisions may have seemed sufficient for the journey. Nevertheless, without even one guide or an animal to ride on, it was not long before both mother and son were at the point of death, once again, utterly lost and without heart. The Apostle Paul explained the spiritual significance of Hagar and Ishmael in Galatians chapter 4. Hagar was a picture of the law, because Sarah and Abraham were within their rights under their law to use Hagar in the way they did. And Ishmael, Hagar's son, was a picture of what happens when people try to establish favor in God's sight through their own efforts. Because this is exactly what Abraham and Sarah were trying to do with Hagar. They were trying to extract God's blessing from God using their own methods. Now, according to Paul's archetype of Hagar and Sarah, we see slave versus free, law versus grace, Mount Sinai, where the law was given, versus Mount Zion, Jerusalem, where God gives mercy. We're seeing Ishmael, born of the flesh, and Isaac, born of the Spirit. Ishmael, who has no share in the inheritance, and Isaac, who is the heir. And of course, the conclusion is we must part with the old life. We must be done with it. Drive it away from us, just as God instructed Abraham to do with Hagar and Ishmael, in order to participate in the new life offered through Messiah Jesus. Salvation, Paul was saying, is as far from the law as Hagar was from Sarah in freedom, and as far as Ishmael was from Isaac in inheritance. But it is vital to remember that Paul's illustration is not the same as Hagar, the real person, whom God loved and protected, whom God provided for and built up into a great nation. Because in that hour, as Hagar lifted up her voice and wept, God intervened. "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy, and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." God had settled a promise and a future on both Hagar and Ishmael. And though they had been driven from Abraham's household, they had not been driven out of God's love and care, nor God's promise. In her own despair, without resources, utterly rejected and destitute, with only death before her, it is no wonder Hagar's spirit was broken. But now God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went, filled the skin with water, and gave the boy a drink. I think that must happen in our lives too. We simply do not see what God has been providing and has been ready for us all along. It was no accident that it was right there at this spot Hagar had come to the end of herself, because God had been waiting there to redeem Hagar, the resident alien, and her son Ishmael. God hears. Now, redemption was originally a technical term used in the ancient Near East. In the world of commerce, it was used specifically in connection with the buying and selling of slaves. A person being sold as a slave could be purchased to own, or could be redeemed for the express purpose of being set free. And the price of redemption was called a ransom. Today would be the day of Hagar's and Ishmael's emancipation. They were enslaved to owners who treated them cruelly. Now God would set them free to live out the promise God had given them. In a similar way, you and I, and all of us really on this planet, find ourselves enslaved to cruel masters, corruption and death, lived out in what the Bible calls sin, falling short of God's glory. There is no way out but to be redeemed by someone who does not belong to those same masters. Just as the angel of the Lord came to Hagar with an invitation and a promise, so Jesus comes to you and me today. Jesus alone is able to redeem us. For being human, Jesus can take our sin in himself, and being God, Jesus has enough to redeem the world. Without God meeting her there, it really would have been Hagar's end, and the end of her son. In the same way, without Jesus, you and I have been condemned to a life of falling short that ends in death. And the truth here is that the Lord uses crises to reveal God's availability and power to redeem. With Jesus, our eyes are opened, and we see a well of living water bubbling up, Jesus' imagery of the Holy Spirit, and our lives are made new, made whole, made complete to overflowing. Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, Jesus said to the woman at the well, pointing to Jacob's well, where she was drawing up water. But those who drink of the water that I will give them will never be thirsty. The water that I will give will become in them a spring of water, gushing up to eternal life. And again, let anyone who is thirsty come to me, said Jesus, and let the one who believes in me drink. As the scripture has said, out of the believer's heart shall flow rivers of living water. And Jesus said this about the Spirit, which believers in him were to receive. The epilogue to this story is found in the last 2 verses of this chapter. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Several ancient Jewish theologians contended that Hagar was actually the Keturah Abraham married at the beginning of chapter 5, after Sarah died. That Abraham sought her out, and by her had several more sons. Now, there's no way to know if this is true. The Bible does not say, but the implication is one of honor. For Hagar is remembered as a matriarch by the Arabic peoples and is much loved by many African American Christians as well, who see their own history in her story of enslavement, sexual abuse, and ultimate liberation. For God did take special interest in Hagar. God gave her unique privileges, and God freed her to live out the great destiny the Lord had specially prepared for her and her son.